Black Waitress fed 3 orphaned brothers. 30 years later, a helicopter lands at her house. On a stormy night in 1993, Waitress Ruby Jackson made a choice that would echo through 3 decades. When 3 homeless brothers pressed their faces against her diner window, everyone else looked away, but Ruby saw hungry children who needed help. What started with hamburgers and fries in a small Alabama diner would grow into something that defied every assumption about poverty, generosity, and the true meaning of wealth. Sometimes the most powerful investments aren't made with money, but with love, and sometimes the returns take 30 years to arrive by helicopter. The fluorescent lights of Mel's diner buzzed like dying insects as Ruby Jackson wiped down the same cracked vinyl booth for the 3rd time that hour. Her uniform, once white but now a weary shade of gray from countless washes, clung to her tired frame as she calculated tips that would barely cover her bus fare home. The diner's broken air conditioner wheezed in the corner, doing little to combat the sweltering heat that made every customer irritable and every shift feel like an endurance test. Ruby had been working these same floors for 15 years, serving coffee and dreams to truckers and night shift workers who passed through her small Alabama town like ghosts in the darkness. Her calloused hands told the story of a woman who had never known luxury, but her eyes still held the fierce determination of someone who refused to let poverty define her worth. Outside the rain-streaked windows, 3 small figures huddled under the diner's flickering neon sign, their clothes soaked through from the storm that had been raging for hours. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12, his arms wrapped protectively around 2 younger boys who shivered against his thin frame. Ruby had noticed them earlier when her shift started, watching as other customers hurried past without acknowledgement, their faces turned away from the uncomfortable reality of children with nowhere to go. The boy's hollow eyes and gaunt cheeks told a story she knew too well. Hunger was a language Ruby had learned to speak fluently during her own childhood in foster care, when meals were uncertain and kindness was even rarer. The diner's owner, Mr. Peterson, emerged from his office with the predatory look of a man who viewed everything through the lens of profit and loss. His eyes followed Ruby's gaze to the window where the 3 brothers pressed their faces against the glass, their breath fogging the surface as they stared at the plates of food being served inside. "Don't even think about it, Ruby," he warned, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who had never missed a meal in his life. "Those street kids are nothing but trouble. They'll steal whatever isn't nailed down and bring in all kinds of problems we don't need." His words hit Ruby like physical blows, but she'd learned long ago to hide her reactions from men who wielded power over her paycheck and survival. As the clock struck midnight and the last paying customer stumbled out into the storm, Ruby made a decision that would echo through the next 3 decades of her life. She watched Peterson count the till with obsessive precision, his fingers caressing each bill like a lover's touch, while outside 3 children continued their vigil in the rain. The boys hadn't moved in hours, their stubborn presence a testament to hope that refused to die even in the face of adult indifference. Ruby knew that feeding them would cost her nearly a full day's wages, money she needed for her own rent and utilities, but she also knew that some choices defined who you were in ways that lasted far beyond their immediate consequences. The mathematics of survival warred with the arithmetic of compassion, and for once in her life, Ruby chose to let her heart overrule her empty bank account. Ruby waited until Peterson's office light clicked off and his footsteps faded into the parking lot before she unlocked the diner's front door. The 3 boys looked up at her with the wary hope of animals who had learned that human kindness often came with hidden costs, their bodies tense and ready to run if this turned out to be another cruel joke played by adults who found their suffering amusing. "You boys hungry?" she asked, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact, as if inviting homeless children into a closed restaurant was the most natural thing in the world. The oldest boy, Marcus, she would later learn, stepped protectively in front of his younger brothers, his 12-year-old shoulders carrying responsibilities that would have crushed most adults twice his age. "We don't have money, ma'am," Marcus said, his voice carrying the careful politeness of a child who had learned that respect might sometimes purchase mercy. The two younger boys, twins named David and Daniel, peered around their brother's frame with eyes that held both desperate hunger and the painful wisdom that came from repeated disappointment. Ruby's heart clenched as she recognized herself in their careful dignity, remembering the countless times she'd been hungry but too proud to beg, too young to understand that needing help wasn't a moral failing, but simply a fact of being human in an indifferent world. "Good thing I'm not selling anything then," Ruby replied, stepping aside to let them enter the warm sanctuary of the diner. She watched as they moved with the practiced caution of survivors, taking in every exit and potential threat even as their bodies gravitated toward the promise of food and shelter. The contrast between their obvious hunger and their ingrained politeness broke something inside her chest. These weren't the street criminals Peterson had described, but children who had somehow maintained their humanity despite a system that had clearly failed them repeatedly. She guided them to a corner booth where they would be hidden from view if Peterson decided to return, then began preparing what would become the most important meal of her life. As Ruby worked in the kitchen, she listened to the boys' whispered conversation, their voices carrying the weight of adult concerns filtered through childhood vocabulary. They spoke of their grandmother who had died 6 months earlier, leaving them to navigate the foster care system that had separated them twice before they'd made the decision to run away and stay together on the streets. Marcus had been working odd jobs to keep them fed, while the twins had learned to find shelter and avoid the kind of adults who preyed on vulnerable children. Their story unfolded in fragments between bites of the hamburgers and fries Ruby placed before them, each detail adding another layer to her understanding of their remarkable resilience and unbreakable bond. "Where will you boys sleep tonight?" Ruby asked as she watched them eat with the focused intensity of people who understood that every meal might be their last. The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that extended far beyond simple logistics. Marcus looked up from his plate, ketchup smeared across his chin, his expression cycling through hope and resignation as he calculated whether this stranger could be trusted with the truth about their desperate circumstances. The twins had fallen asleep against each other in the booth, their small bodies finally relaxing for the first time in hours, their faces peaceful in a way that made Ruby's chest tight with protective instincts she didn't know she possessed. "There's an abandoned building about 6 blocks from here," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking the words too loudly might somehow make their situation more real. "It's got a good roof, and we can see people coming from most directions. We've been there about a week now." The casual way he described their survival strategy hit Ruby like a physical blow. This child had been forced to become a military strategist, thinking about sight lines and escape routes instead of homework and cartoons. She found herself doing mental calculations, trying to figure out how to help without overstepping boundaries she didn't fully understand, knowing that good intentions could sometimes cause more harm than neglect. Ruby made a decision that would define the next chapter of all their lives. "You boys can't keep living like that," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived her own version of abandonment and emerged stronger. "I've got a couch in my living room and a pull-out bed in my spare room. It's not much, but it's warm and dry and safe." The offer seemed to hang in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm, connecting their worlds in ways that defied the social and economic barriers that usually kept people like them separated. Marcus's eyes filled with tears he was too proud to shed, while Ruby felt something click into place in her chest, a sense of purpose that went beyond serving coffee and wiping down tables. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Ruby had ever experienced, as 3 homeless children and a working-class waitress negotiated the terms of an arrangement that would transform all their lives. Marcus insisted on contributing through chores and odd jobs, his pride refusing to accept charity even from someone offering genuine help. The twins, awakened by the discussion, added their own conditions. They wouldn't be separated, they wouldn't go back into the foster system, and they would leave immediately if Ruby ever decided they were too much trouble. Ruby found herself agreeing to terms that seemed absurd given the power dynamic. but she recognized that preserving their dignity was as important as providing for their basic needs. By dawn, they had formed an unlikely family bound not by blood but by mutual respect and the shared understanding that sometimes the most important choices were the ones that made no financial sense whatsoever. Ruby's modest two-bedroom apartment became a battlefield where love fought against poverty with weapons forged from determination and thrift store furniture. Her grocery bill tripled overnight, forcing her to take on double shifts and weekend catering gigs that left her exhausted but fiercely protective of the three boys who had transformed her existence from mere survival into something approaching purpose. The twins shared the pull-out bed while Marcus claimed the couch, but most nights all four of them ended up in the living room, doing homework by lamplight while Ruby darned socks and stretched every dollar until it screamed for mercy. The mathematics of raising three growing boys on a waitress's salary should have been impossible, but Ruby discovered that love was a powerful multiplier when applied to creativity and stubborn refusal to give up. The boys threw themselves into their education with the intensity of people who understood that knowledge was their only reliable path out of poverty. Marcus excelled in mathematics and computer science, his analytical mind finding patterns and solutions that impressed teachers who had initially written him off as another foster care statistic. David and Daniel, despite being twins, pursued different paths, David gravitating toward engineering, while Daniel showed a gift for business and finance that manifested in his ability to help Ruby maximize their household budget. Ruby attended every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every science fair, her work uniform marking her as different from the other parents, but her fierce pride in her boys, making her presence undeniable. The community around them began to take notice as the years passed, watching Ruby's transformation from tired waitress to fierce advocate for children the system had forgotten. She became a voice at school board meetings, demanding better resources for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, her first-hand experience giving weight to arguments that others could only make in abstract terms. The diner's regular customers started leaving bigger tips when they learned about her situation, creating an informal support network that helped bridge the gap between her income and their needs. Peterson, despite his initial warnings, grudgingly admitted that Ruby's boys were some of the most polite and hard-working teenagers he'd ever met, occasionally offering them odd jobs around the diner that helped supplement the household income. As the boys reached high school, their potential became impossible to ignore. Scholarship offers began arriving from universities that had never heard of their small Alabama town, academic institutions recognizing the kind of intellectual gifts that emerged from necessity and nurture in equal measure. Ruby watched with pride and terror as her makeshift family prepared to scatter across the country, knowing that she had given them everything she could, but uncertain whether it would be enough to sustain them in worlds she'd never had the chance to enter. The woman who had started as their rescuer discovered that they had rescued her as well, transforming her life from a series of meaningless shifts into a legacy that would echo through generations she might never meet. 30 years had passed since that stormy night, when Ruby had made the choice that defined her life, and now she stood in her garden, her hair silver, but her spirit still burning with the same fierce determination that had driven her to open the diner's door to three hungry boys. The modest house she'd eventually been able to purchase sat in the same neighborhood where she'd raised Marcus, David, and Daniel, its walls holding decades of memories that money couldn't buy but love had created in abundance. Her arthritis made the long shifts at the diner increasingly difficult, but retirement seemed impossible on a waitress's savings, especially with the medical bills that had mounted since her diabetes diagnosis the previous year. The sound began as a distant rumble, growing louder until it shook the windows of every house on the block and sent Ruby's neighbors rushing to their front porches with expressions of curiosity and concern. As the helicopter descended toward her small backyard, Ruby felt her heart racing with the kind of anticipation that came from knowing something life-changing was about to happen, though she couldn't imagine what it might be. The aircraft was sleek and expensive, bearing the logo of Wellington Industries, a name she recognized from business news segments that occasionally interrupted her afternoon soap operas. The rotor wash flattened her tomato plants and scattered the lawn chairs she'd arranged for the church potluck she was hosting that weekend. 3 men emerged from the helicopter, their movements confident but somehow familiar as they approached her back door. Ruby's breath caught in her chest as recognition dawned. The faces were older, marked by success and responsibility, but the eyes were unmistakably those of the boys she'd fed hamburgers and helped with homework for 7 transformative years. Marcus, now Dr. Marcus Wellington, CEO of the tech company whose logo adorned the helicopter, walked with the measured pace of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms, but still carrying the protective instincts of an older brother. David and Daniel flanked him, their expensive suits unable to disguise the deep affection and respect that had always defined their relationship with the woman who had saved their lives. "Hello, Mama Ruby," Marcus said, using the name they'd called her since that first night in the diner, his voice thick with emotion as he embraced the woman whose courage had made everything else possible. The years fell away as Ruby found herself surrounded by the 3 men who would always be her boys, regardless of their net worth or professional achievements. Through her tears, she noticed the manila envelope Daniel carried, the serious expressions on their faces, and the way they seemed to be building up to something momentous. The helicopter that had brought them wasn't just transportation. It was a symbol of how far they'd traveled from that stormy night when their biggest concern had been finding somewhere warm and dry to sleep. "We've been planning this for 5 years, David explained as they settled around Ruby's kitchen table, the same scarred surface where they'd done homework and shared dreams that had seemed impossible from their perspective as homeless children. Ever since we found out about your medical bills and realized you were working double shifts just to keep up with the treatments." The envelope contained documents that Ruby couldn't fully comprehend at first glance. Legal papers, financial statements, and photographs of properties that seemed to exist in a different universe from her modest Alabama neighborhood. Marcus gently explained that they had established a foundation in her name, dedicated to supporting families who opened their homes to children aging out of foster care. "This house," Daniel said, his voice carrying the same careful precision he'd shown as a child explaining how he'd stretched their grocery budget, "is now completely paid off, along with a trust fund that will cover all your medical expenses and provide a comfortable living allowance for the rest of your life." The numbers on the papers seemed abstract to Ruby, figures with so many zeros that they felt like a foreign language, but the implications were crystal clear. She would never have to worry about money again, never have to choose between medication and groceries, never have to work another painful shift at the diner if she didn't want to. But the financial security, life-changing though it was, paled in comparison to what came next. Marcus pulled out a folder thick with photographs and testimonials from families across the country who had been inspired by their story to open their homes to children in need. "You didn't just save 3 boys," he said, his CEO composure cracking as emotion overwhelmed his carefully prepared presentation. "You started a movement." The Ruby Jackson Foundation has facilitated over 3,000 placements in the past decade, connecting kids with families who learned from your example that love is more powerful than poverty. The ripple effects of her one act of kindness had created waves that stretched across generations and geography, touching lives she would never meet, but whose trajectories had been altered by her courage. As Ruby absorbed the magnitude of what they were telling her, she realized that the helicopter hadn't just brought her boys home. It had brought proof that kindness was an investment that paid dividends across decades, that a single meal shared with hungry children could compound into a legacy that would outlast any fortune. The waitress who had worried about having enough money for bus fare had somehow managed to create wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars, but in lives transformed, families created, and hope restored to children who had given up on the possibility of finding adults who cared about their welfare without expecting anything in return. Ruby's single act of kindness had multiplied into a foundation that changed thousands of lives, proving that wealth isn't always measured in dollars, but in the courage to care when no one else will. The boys who once had nothing became men who gave everything back to the woman who taught them that family isn't about blood, It's about choice. How many hungry children are pressing their faces against windows right now, waiting for someone brave enough to unlock the door?